I want to welcome Professor Declan Troy from Teagasc, something like that, sorry, the Research Institute in Ashtown, Dublin. He will give an overview of what we can expect from academic research in meat science when looking to the future, as well as meat legacy. So, please, Declan, give us your view about your future. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Theo, and to Sarah and the organising committee for a very kind invitation to speak here. I'm conscious it's the last session of the or speaker of today, so I won't delay too long. It's not too heavy. It's quite a helicopter view type presentation. So it contains a lot of information and opinion, and it's the way we see things. I'm also, I don't know if you mentioned Theo, but I'm also the International Secretariat of the International Congress of Meat Science and Technology. And, you know, collectively, that's most of the people who attend that every year, we're quite concerned about the direction of meat science in its present form. So we've decided to take some action, so you'll hear about some of those. But even attracting good students and scientists, PhD students to meat science is a challenge. So what I'm just going to mention briefly is why do we do meat science? Why bother with it? Why let it do its own thing? I mean, there's lots of other foods that don't have a big community of scientists supporting the system. So why do it? So I mentioned a couple of things. What have we done up to now? And Theo asked me to address the legacy and where we are now. And I know Aero and others have touched on that, so I won't delay too long on that. What has worked and what has not worked, I mentioned that. The current situation, particularly some of the aspects that Andre spoke about there in terms of plant protein, insects, cell-based meat, etc. Future research areas as well, because we have to keep the show on the road. We know it's not going to disappear, this industry, tomorrow. So we still have to make sure there's a pipeline of highly qualified and knowledgeable scientists and leaders hidden into the industry and into government bodies and into universities and research institutes. What's needed then is what I mentioned earlier, that we do really need to do something. We can't just sit back. And then this was where I struggled, inspiration for meat science in the future, but there are some real nuggets in there, and I mentioned those briefly. So again, very briefly, and we know what's driving the whole, why are we doing this, is because really the population of the world is growing immensely and they have to be fed. Very simple. And also when I notice when meat scientists are doing research in a laboratory and they see their test tubes, their Warner Bradsers, their equipment, they don't look out the window and see what's really, where does that measurement fit into the world. So just, and this is why I just mentioned this very briefly, that the actual production of meat is worth nearly $2.5 billion. So that's a huge resource to service in a broad sense. That's what we're underpinning, a massive industry. And it's projected to grow even beyond that up to 2026, despite what we hear in the rich Western Europe and Northern America is actually growing the consumption of meat quite substantially. So, and then when we put it down to animals, what type of number of animals do we have? So I know we had a chicken producer in the audience there. Well, he contributes to the 69 billion chickens that are produced a year, 1.5 billion pigs, you know, more than 500 million turkeys, etc., etc. So that's again a huge resource that should underpin where we fit in to the world. Just on top of that, we note that what drives a lot of consumption of meat and the growth of meat is actually affluence. You know, people being able to afford it, and you know, thank God, the people of South America, the Far East, and in many parts of Africa now, India, well, Asia, I should say, are discovering that actually they now can afford high quality protein coming from animal sources. And you can see there's a very good correlation there between meat consumption and countries. So that's again, and the last fact on this type of marketing area is that it looks like there could be 3 billion extra consumers of meat being produced between 2010 and 2030. So they're adding to the pot in terms of being affluent. So that's where we fit into the wider world of the industry in a broader sense. But what does actually, why are people eating meat? And again, this has been touched on quite a bit today, but again, very basically, it's nutrition. That's what's driving it. People eat to not to starve, say. And within that, meat is a high value food and quality food in terms of nutritional status, obviously for its proteins, irons, vitamins, and other metals. Also, the value of meat is the economic value on the farm, off the farm, in processing, in rural communities, in the retail, and then exports, which create jobs, create wealth. So, sorry. Too many, I think. Sorry, yeah. Sorry about that. Economic then, it's a huge driver as well. Food security then, and we noted that, and the food industry in general, but particularly the meat sector, should take a bow for its robustness in terms of the recent COVID crisis, that despite the outbreaks in the industry, they still kept the lights burning. And as far as I know, I didn't see any shortage of meat products, you know. So again, it is a robust industry. Obviously, it's culturally embedded in our communities and different regions. Socially then at mealtime restaurants for pleasure. I mentioned for livelihoods, especially in the less developed countries. And also one of the main attributes of meat being so important is that certainly from grass-fed systems that you're actually converting non-food feed into human feed. And that's a huge issue, you know, in terms of just what's available in terms of grass. And, you know, obviously land use is limited, and certainly where land couldn't be used for some of the plants that were told are in the mix, aren't used for, can't be used for those plants or growing alternatives. So it's used for grazing, for letting sheep out, wild boars or cattle indeed. So that's again the context of why people are eating meat. Then just to very briefly address the history of meat science, and I won't go into detail in this because there's many others did, and it's published there under an American Meat Science Association publication. But basically, I was staggered to see that the first meat laboratory was built around the 1900s. I see someone disagreeing with that, but this is in the paper, and that it grew then from there into Michigan, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, etc. And that the interest in grading after the war sort of spurred on a lot of the expansion of the shows and the quality and the differentiation of the carcass. And that itself then brought in a direction towards objective measurements, particularly obviously in terms of the quality, but also on safety, water holding capacity, color, and then right up to tenderness. There was more training in the basic science then came into it. The more molecular approaches to meat science came in the early 90s and continues today. And then muscle biology groups grew. So that's just a very quick linear line of the advances in core meat science over the last century, more or less. So what has all that contributed then to the meat sector? Well, basically, it has really made it robust in terms of safety. It's actually a lot safer to eat meat than it was back in the 50s and 60s. The whole HACCP regimes, the packaging developments, the packaging. Obviously, our animal welfare procedures are much more stringent and more animal friendly, say, both on farm and in transport, and indeed at the slaughter end. It's more nutritious as a food. I remember pork, certainly in Ireland, some cuts of pork, you wouldn't see the lean, it was just a lump of fat. Especially colour bacon, the salt used to be something like 7 or 8% injected at one stage. So, you know, meat science has allowed meat to be much more nutritious as a product, both in reducing fat and other important non-nutrients. Then we can look at the automation that was mentioned earlier today. The eating quality is now being defined not only on a cuts basis or even a muscle basis, but almost at molecular level and fiber level. The application of technologies like video image analysis, hyperspectral, we heard about infrared there, stimulation, precision chilling, all of this is adding to the toolbox for the industry to implement a safer, more consistent, nutritious meat product. And then a robust knowledge base of how to produce meat that's safe has been built up both from the, you know, fairly well globally, I'd say. So I'm not saying ICOMS, the International Congress of Meat Science and Technology, can take credit for that, but what it did do was act as the forum or the sort of hub for researchers around the world to actually communicate their advancements in all those areas I mentioned, whether it's quality, nutrition, interventions and technologies. And that Congress has been going since 1955, when it was first formed in Finland. And I'm only using this to illustrate that there's good news there, because since 55, it's gone right on to Madrid in 98 on the 44th one. You can see the outputs. 55 in Denmark, the 55th Congress was held in 09 in Denmark. And last year we had a hybrid Congress in Krakow, right up. But not only that, the knowledge that's come from those, has been in an office in Finland, as you can see. And these are really the core of meat science, because most of these papers ended up in peer-reviewed journals, either in animal science, meat science, or whatever. So there's a whole hub of them there, right to 91. And of course, that office is owned by this man, Eero Palani, who was the speaker. Now, what he had a vision to do was actually, he was looking at these books, and apart from wanting to save space, he wanted to know what should he do with this information, because it wasn't digitized. It was actually still in its analog state, i.e. paper. But he decided to form a project called Digicomps. And he actually now, with the help of many other countries, including the Netherlands and many others, and we supported him in indexing the whole shebang. And that's under Digicomps. And I would really say it's one of the best resources any student of meat science could use. It's completely open access, it's freely available, and it's highly searchable. So you can just put in any keyword and you can get every paper, you know, short paper that was presented since 1955. And it's incredible the usefulness of some of the information that's in there. So, and it's just that simple web address there. You don't need a password, you don't need anything, you can just go straight in. And it's a huge resource. I should say this year's Congress is in ICOMS is in Japan, in Kobe, but unfortunately it's had to go virtual since March. They took a decision. They're still in quite a bit of lockdown, but I would encourage people, they have a fantastic program arranged. I would encourage people to register and participate. So the future role of ICOMS in that regard then is supporting the meat science in underpinning a global sustainable meat industry while accelerating innovation. And that's one of our core aims, that we don't compromise on the science, but we don't ignore the industry or that translational part that Andrew spoke about there recently. And at a time when the role of animal-based protein as a source of food is under attack, and I don't mean by scientists, it's often by social media and vested interests, it's really important that the science leads the argument, not the emotions. And I think ICOMS can be used as a sort of as a participant in that regard. Meat has become and will continue to become a major societal food source, not only in providing essential nutrients, but sustainable livelihoods on farms and in the industry. And it'll also, ICOMS will continue to contribute to the next generation of knowledge and leadership. And not all the participants of ICOMS end up as researchers or lecturers in research institutes or universities. Many of them become a part of government boards or Department of Food Safeties or agricultural departments in government. And we come across them regularly now. And that's some of the legacy that meat science has also produced. So basically, what I think meat science community, not just ICOMS, but the actual community has generated is the leaders in academic, in the public sector. I mentioned for instance, the EFSA, the USDA, etc., and also industry leaders. It's transferred best practice, more consistent, more efficient processing. Has also increased indirectly the production and sales of quality meat. And I think any meat scientist working over years can take a bow and say, yes, it has done. The industry often doesn't give credit for that, but I know for a fact there is a strong line from the science to the implementation, to the market sales and to the supermarket turnovers. It's decreased the safety risks, I mentioned, increased the nutritional aspects. It's underpinned meat processing with science-based evidence. That's always important and very much of use. And we mentioned it improved the grading systems, hopefully for a fairer price to be paid straight back to the farmer or the animal owner or grower. But have we done enough? Well, I would say probably not. We still have a lot more to do. And I think we still we're needed a lot more, because one thing I think we really need, and it's a theme that came up in a number of talks today, is we must articulate the science better, not to ourselves. We're great at talking to each other, scientists are, but actually talking to other people, to other broader audiences. We need to engage much more on an equal basis with the industry and other stakeholders, and their funding agencies, they're the European Commission, etc., etc. Equally, what's been noticeable is that people are almost defensive on their meat science work. They're almost afraid to say they work in meat science because of just the current climate, especially in Western Europe. So it's very important not to be defensive, to actually be proactive. We need to influence funders. We need also to increase global collaboration. So while I said ICOMS is very good as a meeting place, there's very few activities that actually are globally transient, you know, like collective countries participate in. But yet there is a need to raise all the boats and to be pre-competitive in that type of approach. And it's something we're certainly looking into, see can we stimulate interest in that across the globe. I know there are examples like the Meat Standards Australia. It's one good example that has helped gain some global collaboration, but I don't think it's enough. It needs to be across the research community. We need to stop the decline in number of meat scientists worldwide, not only the number, but actually also the depth of science and knowledge. Time and time again, the industry say to us, you know, we're not happy with the graduates coming from food science courses or agricultural science courses. They haven't got the depth of meat science that they come in like years ago. That's what they more or less say. And when you look around, and certainly in Europe, and we're looking at it in locally in Ireland, is we do think there is a need for a global meat science training that everyone can tap into, everyone can contribute, and we can all gain from that. And that would also improve the messaging I spoke about earlier, that sort of consistent messaging where science does the talking and we're on the same page. However, this is the current situation, and again, you could pick any of these and give a whole workshop on them. But obviously, the criticism of the methane emissions produced by particularly cattle, the Lancet report, the growth in vegetarianism, and almost the anti-meat culture that's there, albeit in a small amount, but very active and well funded. Also, the science integrity is very important, because there are examples, and I know of one in particular where the science integrity of an editorial board, where they got a paper, because it was dealing with meat, they had a different lens on it, which was purely based on where they were coming from. So that's very important. The cultured meat I mentioned, and almost the propaganda around what and when it will deliver and when will it deliver. And I've just a couple of thoughts on that at the moment. What we call the global south issues, because if you go to Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and South America, and parts of China, and we tell them, the Western Europeans, to go vegetarian or to go much less meat, they get very annoyed, because they're dependent on the growth of the animals industry and the animal protein industry. So that's something that, as someone said, we don't often look for a global lens, we look very locally. And that's, again, should be addressed. The lack of research opportunities, both nationally and EU, because we're dealing with meat as well. Industry commitment also is often lacking. We know the small margins that was mentioned, but still, we do think that the industry are getting good value from the public funded research in meat science. And that, I think there is, and in Ireland, we have actually an example of where they have stepped up to the mark in that regard. I mentioned not only the training and development, but the retention of meat scientists as meat scientists. There's a lot of turnover in meat science posts at the moment. The lab-grown meat was mentioned earlier, and there's a chap called Professor Paul Wood in Monash University, an excellent guy who's done a big study into this lab-grown meat. Is supposed to be inevitable, but the science tells a different story. And if you look at his findings, I won't go into any detail. Maybe Professor Post is nearby, who I know very well, and very great guy. But the final process, production process, the cost estimates, the pharmaceutical approach that needs to be done, the nutritional value, the need that will be to add flavor, either oils, fats, or cultured fats, are neither described or costed. Obviously, the cost. And then I added my own one at the end there, market contradiction, because I spoke to a CEO of one of these companies in California, and he was very on about cultured meat and his meat. And I said, who's your customer? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, obviously vegetarians and vegans, and maybe people who want to reduce, that are into healthy food, etc. And I said, do you really think they'd eat food coming from a biofermentator or something called meat? And he said, well, he would anyway. That was his answer. So I don't know, I'm not into the market end of this, but I'm not sure it's as near as we're led to believe. So what we're doing about it is that in October 19th and 20th, a group of scientists from America, Australia, Europe, have decided, right, it's time to make a start on this and really talk about the societal role of meat, what the science says. And what it's about is getting in meat scientists into the room, getting the industry, yes, but mainly the NGOs, the government supports, the departments, the retailers, the consumer groups, whoever, and we really want to lay out very clearly the issues in terms of the whole societal role of meat. So the summit aims to promote the use of proven evidence to debate the role of meat in society. So the areas they're covering over the 2 days are the role of meat in diet and health, the role of meat in the environment, and the role of meat in society, economics, and culture. So we really want to say, let the science speaks, and NGOs are really welcome. In fact, we're going to go chasing them into the room because it'll be one of the first times we'll really have that dialogue. What's going to be produced from that is about 6 or 7 position papers written by a group of eminent scientists from around the world that will be exchanged and freely available for use in anyone else's argument they may have locally or abroad. So while we don't have the funding that other groups have, is our tuppence worth in this debate. But I think the main thing is that it is letting the science speak. So just getting back on meat science in general and what worked and what didn't work, one of the issues I always feel as well that, as I said, meat science is very much generally publicly funded. Therefore, it's down at the technology readiness level of 2 to 4. The industry funds internally mainly its own R&D, which is very much product development, looking at processes, etc. And it's very much at the technology readiness level 6 to 7. And this isn't just for meat science, but is particularly relevant to meat science, because really what happens then is that there's that gap. You know, it's called the valley of death, whatever else we want to call it. But sometimes scientists are too comfortable over that end and really never make the effort to cross the bridge or even go under the bridge. And equally, the industry, because of their technology absorbance, which they often lack, not widely in some cases, they never go under the bridge from this angle. So really there is a need to train scientists to actually get under that bridge and also have a much more mature industry that feels comfortable going under the bridge. So one consortium that we run in Ireland is actually called mEATquality Ireland, and it's exactly what happened there. It's where we got these companies, Slaney, ABP, Dawn Meats, Keypack, etc. These are pretty aggressive, you know, robust exporting large companies of Irish meat. And they got together, even though they're absolute competitors, but they managed to agree on a pre-competitive agenda that they all felt they could raise their game collectively. And when they did that, the government or the state agency, Enterprise Ireland, also came in with funding. So they just, for the last 5 years, they've been working on a set agenda that's jointly funded by all the companies plus the state agency to the value of about 8.5 million euro. And the research providers, including Teagasc and some universities, are doing the research with the industry. And it's really brought the research community much closer to the industry because we see where they're coming from and they see where we're coming from. And why we know it's been a success is they're just about to launch mEATquality Ireland 2, which is valued at 12.5 million, with even more money percentage from the industry than before. So that's a good example of where, and just I won't go into the details in the areas, but the areas were in the genomic predictions, the tenderness management, microbial safety, shelf life extension, the grading systems, the area of meat and health, and also new markets, particularly from grass-fed beef opportunities. So they all felt they were enough pre-competitive that all the companies would gain equally when they go into the marketplace. And now they've developed a second program in different areas, you know, obviously around sustainability, big data, etc., for the next 5 years. But there's no reason, possibly, maybe there are, but possibly, that type of model shouldn't go, you know, couldn't be a global type model where you get all the international companies wondering, could there be a common agenda particularly on diet and health, where every meat company would benefit from a program that demonstrates the value of meat and health. So then I was asked to address the future areas of meat research, and I won't go into these in detail because Meat Science toward 2030 is an Australian Meat Processors Corporation, AMPC, document where they really went dived very deeply, asking researchers and industry, where do they think, what do they see as the next stage research areas? So I won't go into them in great detail, but you can see areas like climate change strategies and the impacts of those, because if you're going to use additives like the NOP, or you're going to change the breeding regimes because of low methane, or you're going to change the slaughter age, that all needs to be underpinned by meat science. Equally, repositioning red meat as a superfood based on solid science and evidence, etc. I won't go right down, but you can see even some mentioned plant-based substitutes fall into the category of ultra-processed foods. So the demonstration of the other side as well. So there's no reason why work on cellular meat shouldn't be part of a meat science role, and where they actually say exactly what cellular meat comprises of and where it is. So more to put it in context, equally with the plant-based, the rewards and recognition for quality, that's always a bailiwick, the feedback, automation and robotics we heard about, imaging, food safety, a food systems approach as well. That's something that's changed in the last 5 to 7 years, where instead of looking at any aspect as a point in the food chain, you look at the whole food system approach. And that's kicking up opportunities in the bioeconomy and the areas of revaluing some of the waste streams as well. But anyway, obviously welfare will always be important. The circular economy I mentioned, and also the development of more and better value-added meat products as well. So there are the 2 pages, or maybe 10 or 15 areas that the researchers feel would be the next agenda, say. But going back to the role of meat science and the global communication, we need to do it much better than we are. The image of meat science should be raised to a professional standard, and as I said, not to apologise for it. The links with ICOMPS, AMSA, the Meat and Livestock Australia, and others are critical in this regard, because we can really bring critical mass to this. Our next, and I was at a meeting this morning regarding the sort of the hit list of the industry representatives, the International Meat Secretariat, the chief executives of the meat industry in Europe, that's UCBEV, the FAO, the UN, and then the European Meat Products Association. They all should be listening to us every much as listening to some of their market type people, for future issues. Global training program I mentioned. And then I mentioned the need to accelerate innovation and commercialization. The industry will always want that. Any company in any country will say researchers are too slow to respond. And that is the nature of the beast, because obviously things don't happen. It's research, so we don't know what's going to happen next. Researchers have one eye on publication, managing PhD students, etc. But nonetheless, there's enough, I feel there's enough latent potential in Digicomps there that if researchers with industry interrogated what's even in that repository, they would gain a lot in terms of innovation and commercialization. So last slide, or second last slide, is the inspiration. So if I was talking to a potential meat scientist who was wondering, should they develop a career, I would say one thing, that there's big questions need to be answered, that they can contribute to really big questions. like the ones I mentioned on climate change, health, nutrition, etc. And science, it will always be the core of meat science's role. And if it isn't, they should ask the question themselves. But really, meat science should lead the way. Science should lead the way. Meat science are always, well, I think in more demand, there will be a more demand by stakeholders, because at the end of the day, government need the answers to questions based on science, not based on tweets and social media. They'll need the evidence, and that's what we're trying to gather. There's exciting opportunities in big data, digitization, genomics, automation, and the whole farm to fork approach. But one thing, and we've outreach to South Africa, Zimbabwe, in particular on, there's need to transfer a lot of the basic knowledge that those countries, African countries and other less developed countries, can really use in order to enhance everything I mentioned, not only the quality, but the safety, nutrition, etc. And that's all there. It's only a matter of connecting. So I feel what's needed is strategic collaborations. Researchers need to stand up and be proactive. Meat science shouldn't depend on public funding solely. It should be supported definitely by public funding because of all the impacts it has on society, but still it should also demands a bit more coordinated funding globally from the industry. Industry reps should develop with the meat science community a pre-competitive research agenda, I mentioned that, and there's really a great need to communicate beyond ourselves, beyond the meat science. So that's what we hope this conference will be the start of. It's certainly not going to be a one-all and that's it, a fix. It is only the start of the debate, and we're already planning the second one of these before even the first one has started, because we really think that forum needs to be there much more than just core science. It's actually putting it with people who would not attend Digicomps. These are people in Department of Health, Department of Agriculture, Department of Economics, etc., etc. So that's the end.